Number 9. Philip Roberts. In late January of 2015, at a 24-hour fitness facility in Irving, Texas, a man randomly stabbed another gym goer while she was on the treadmill. Local authorities were first called to the gym after witnesses had noticed suspicious behavior from 32-year-old Philip Roberts, who was wearing a trench coat and carrying a suitcase. Roberts had been working out with a guest membership, and regulars at the gym had seen him with his suitcase before. Another call was placed roughly 20 minutes after the first to report that Roberts had repeatedly stabbed a woman with a screwdriver. Justin Harper, a former police officer for the Blue Mound Police Department, was working out only a few feet from where the attack had occurred. Roberts had approached the unnamed victim as she was walking on the treadmill and stabbed her in the back. Afterwards, both he and her fell in front of Harper's treadmill. The former officer and another gym goer tackled the attacker and held him to the ground. Harper later told a media outlet that he suspected Roberts had mental health issues, noting that he had a crazed, glazed-over look in his eyes. It was only after the police had arrived at the scene that Harper saw Roberts had a particularly dull Phillips head screwdriver with him. The victim was rushed to a Dallas hospital with 3 puncture wounds to her neck and back, from which she was reportedly left with a punctured lung. Fortunately, she wasn't described as being in life-threatening condition. According to Harper, whom the victim's husband thanked for his intervention, Roberts had told the police that the attack had simply popped into his head. He was charged with aggravated assault with a deadly weapon and held on a $100,000 bail. Number 8. Charles Lalonde. In the summer of 2018, a video began circulating online of a teenager who was violently thrown out of a gym in Montreal, Canada, for deadlifting too loudly. On August the 2nd, Charles Lalonde, aged 19, had set up his phone to record himself as he pulled 350 pounds at the BuzzFit Center. He was planning on sending the footage to his trainer, but it ended up showing the altercation instead. As Lalonde was making his lift attempt, another man, wearing a tank top with the word "animal" printed on it, aggressively approached him. He stepped on Lalonde's barbell and pushed it down, causing the teenager to abruptly drop the heavy weight. The move could have resulted in Lalonde being seriously injured, and although he wasn't hurt, the video would show him wincing in the moments that followed. A heated exchange ensued in which the other man repeatedly told Lalonde, "You're out," before pushing him into a wall. The teenager had reportedly been warned by gym staff in the past about his loud deadlifting and told that he had to place shock-absorbing mats under the discs if he wanted to continue using the facility. He complied, but the other weightlifter, who wasn't reported as a BuzzFit worker, took it upon himself to kick him out. The video of the confrontation went viral in the aftermath and has been viewed over 9 million times on YouTube alone. Staff banned the unnamed aggressor from the gym, while Lalonde was offered a year-long free membership to his dream gym in Montreal, SSP Barbell Club. Number 7. Essex Gym Altercation. In November of 2019, a brutal fight erupted at a fitness center in Essex, England, in which men battered each other using pieces of fitness equipment. It's unclear what led to the altercation, which was captured on video by another gym goer at the Absolute Gym in Brentwood. The footage showed a group pinning a man wearing a blue tracksuit against a weight rack and striking him repeatedly in the head and body with metal bars. In a separate scene of the conflict, one gym goer raised a detached pull-down bar above his head and swung it at a rival involved in the melee. Perhaps the most shocking moment in the expletive-laden footage was of a man curled up on the floor in the fetal position and protecting his head with a disc weight as a brawler kicked him in the back and struck him with a dumbbell bar. None of those involved were identified, but a police report did mention that a man in his late teens suffered bruising and cuts, while another, aged 27, was left with a cut above his eye. Absolute described the fight as an isolated incident, reaffirmed its stance against violence, and mentioned that all of the men taking part in the row were banned for life. Number 6. Blythe Mason Boyle. In March of 2019, shortly after leaving the Energy Fitness Gym in Birmingham, England, a young woman was viciously attacked by a carjacker in his late teens. Blythe Mason Boyle, aged 24, had just finished her workout and was heading to her Audi A1 parked on Coventry Road, Sheldon. Majid Ali approached the woman and without provocation or warning, struck her in the head with a hammer. Before Mason Boyle could regain her composure, he drove off in her vehicle. The victim suffered cuts to her face and a shattered eye socket, which resulted in permanent vision damage. Photos released by the police would show her with a severely swollen eye from which blood poured down to her chest. Mason Boyle would also need counseling in the aftermath to overcome the trauma of her ordeal. Local authorities were tipped off and identified Ali as the perpetrator, locating the Audi within 24 hours of the violent carjacking. The hammer used in the attack was found hidden underneath a sofa bed after a warrant was executed at his Spark Hill home. 18-year-old Ali denied charges of robbery, possession of an offensive weapon and wounding, but the police proved he'd been responsible and noted he felt no remorse over the attack. Ali was found guilty less than a year after the incident and was given a 2-year and 9-year sentence to run concurrently. Number 5. Jaime Antonio Meza. Roughly 5 months after he and his girlfriend had broken up in 2018, Colombian man Jaime Antonio Meza kept visiting the same gym as her in the city of Segovia. Meza, who worked as a miner, reportedly hoped they'd reconcile the relationship, which had lasted for about 10 years prior to their separation. Surveillance footage would show them talking on a flight of stairs. The verbal exchange remained unclear, but it devolved into Meza pouncing on the unnamed woman and punching her in the face. He dragged her to the ground by her hair, whereupon his barrage of strikes persisted. Meza then attempted to flee up the stairs, but his ex-girlfriend charged after him and pulled him down, causing the man to fall onto his back on the bottom step. As they struggled on the gym floor, Meza once again ended up in top position and continued punching the woman with even greater force than in the altercation's earlier stage. Before leaving the room, he kicked his ex-girlfriend in the back of the head, then flung her across the room by her hair. According to updates on the matter, the woman was hospitalized in serious but stable condition, while the police had started looking to arrest Meza but still hadn't brought him into custody. Number 4. Incident in Mexico City. In February of 2022, a harrowing surveillance video began circulating online of a woman who suffered a fatal accident at a gym in Mexico City. The unnamed 42-year-old was shown attempting to squat a barbell that had been loaded with approximately 400 pounds. The small-framed gym-goer lifted the weight, equivalent to that of a silverback gorilla, off the rack and for a few seconds appeared to be in control of it. She then started a downward motion, but her entire body buckled underneath the tremendous weight. As her daughter and another weightlifter looked on in shock, she slumped to the ground with the barbell on her neck. Others in the gym rushed to her aid and lifted the weight off her, and the woman collapsed backwards, unconscious, with blood pouring from her head. Paramedics from the Red Cross subsequently pronounced the woman dead at the scene. The Mexico City office of the Attorney General launched an investigation into the incident, but no further information was made available to the media as of early March 2022. Number 3. Christmas Abbott. TV personality Christmas Abbott narrowly avoided serving a jail sentence following an incident outside a gym in Tampa, Florida in August of 2018. Abbott, who a year prior had finished third on the 19th season of Big Brother US, had recently found out that Benjamin Bunn, the father of her child, had been having an affair. The CrossFit star was 8 months pregnant at the time, and she drove to the gym, which was owned by Bunn, to confront him and the alleged mistress, named as Samantha Morse. Upon entering the facility, she started screaming at Bunn while referring to Morse as a pathetic homewrecker, and threw an iced coffee across the room. Once outside, she got into her Mercedes-Benz SUV and rammed Morse's car multiple times. When an officer arrived at the scene, Abbott began crying and confessed to have lost it and crashed her Benz into the car because its owner had been allegedly sleeping with her child's father. Due to the advanced state of her pregnancy, the arresting officers didn't take her into custody, but issued a warrant that would allow Abbott to turn herself in after she gave birth. On October the 8th, about a month after her son was born, the TV personality faced the legal consequences of her car-smashing rampage and was charged with felony criminal mischief. Following a plea agreement, she was sentenced to 12 months probation and 25 hours of community service, ordered to pay $1,357.95 in restitution and complete an anger management class. Number 2. Roseville LA Fitness row. In March of 2014, a mass brawl, the quelling of which required the intervention of local authorities, erupted at an LA Fitness gym in Roseville, Minnesota. The fighting had reportedly started out on the basketball court before spilling into the fitness area, where 4 men had chased another. 10 to 15 men, some of whom attempted to defuse the situation, were ultimately involved in the altercation. The man that the group of 4 had been chasing was directed by the LA Fitness manager to stay by the front desk and juice bar. Police Lieutenant Lorne Rosend told a media outlet that the others then started throwing 2.5, 5 and 10 pound weights at the bar, and their male target. They also used barbells and a trash can lid as projectiles in their onslaught. Police officers were successful in tempering the situation and 6 men were taken into custody. 3 were identified as Minneapolis residents Ali Yusuf Bade and Abdi Rashid Yassin Duad, both 18, and Burnsville man Mohammed Awil Suleiman, aged 20. They were charged with disorderly conduct and participation in a riot. The LA Fitness location had been plagued with crime in recent years. In 2013, Roseville police responded to 147 incidents at the gym, and in 2014, officers had already been called 24 times in the months leading up to the mass brawl. Number 1. Samuel Kiwaz. On March the 19th, at an Anytime Fitness location in Culver City, California, a man was knocked off his treadmill after an SUV plowed through the floor-to-ceiling glass window near him. The victim, Samuel Kiwaz, would later report, "It's a miracle that I'm alive." He'd been warming up on a treadmill in preparation for a group fitness class. As the Mercedes SUV came crashing through the window, it made contact with Kiwaz's treadmill and launched him off it, also sending a multitude of glass shards in his direction. Kiwaz flew back into a door which opened as he hit it, saving him from further injuries. As the treadmills were pushed into the walls by the crashing vehicle, an employee helped him to his feet, wiping blood from his face and mouth. The female driver of the SUV, who'd allegedly experienced a failure of the brakes on her vehicle, also got out to check if Kiwaz was alright but then attempted to leave. She was stopped from fleeing by an off-duty officer working out at the gym and later interviewed by the authorities. Number 7. Susan and William Shmirer. 65-year-old Susan Shmirer and her 64-year-old husband William left their home in Williamsburg, Virginia on May the 27th of 2018. They had planned for a cross-country vacation that would eventually bring them all the way to Palm Springs, California, a week later. However, what had started as an exciting summer getaway to the sun-soaked shores of one of California's most popular tourist destinations soon turned into an extensive search for the Shmirers, who had gone missing not long after their arrival in Palm Springs. The investigation into their whereabouts began on June the 13th after the San Bernardino Sheriff's Department received a tip that a vehicle had been parked near the Amboy Crater National Landmark in the Mojave Desert. Since June the 2nd, they soon discovered the car belonged to the Shmirers, and an aviation crew was called in to sweep the area in search of the missing couple. In the days that followed, the Sheriff's Department recruited the help of volunteer searchers to aid in the rescue efforts. A few days after the investigation had begun, the remains of an unidentified male were found. A coroner later confirmed it to be the body of William Shmirer, though his wife remained missing for nearly a year. In May of 2019, her body was finally found in the desert, east of the Amboy Crater. The search for Susan had taken so long because of the extreme daytime temperatures typical of the Mojave Desert. The area she was eventually found in occasionally hit highs of 160 degrees Fahrenheit. The autopsies confirmed the Shmirers had passed away due to heat exposure. Number 6. Erica Lloyd. 37-year-old Erica Lloyd, a single mother from California, went missing in a sparsely populated desert region near Joshua Tree National Park. She'd embarked on what she described as a pandemic road trip in the midsummer months of 2020. Her final destination was Joshua Tree, located some 500 miles southeast of her home in the city of Walnut Creek. The trip came as a surprise to her 12-year-old son and her roommates, whom Lloyd hadn't notified of her escapade until she was already walking out the door. She kept in contact with family members for the first couple of days, but the communication ceased on June the 16th. Lloyd had spoken to her mother on the phone that day, but the conversation was extremely peculiar, and the woman had begun to suspect something was wrong. Later that same day, Lloyd's car was found by local police, abandoned and vandalized, near a highway intersection in 29 Palms. She was never heard from again. For 8 months, the authorities combed through the vast California desert, hoping to find clues regarding her whereabouts. The search yielded no concrete results, but on January the 31st of 2021, hikers in Wonder Valley came upon what they believed to be human bones, roughly 10 miles east of 29 Palms. The remains were later identified as belonging to Erica Lloyd. The police investigation into her death found no evidence of foul play, though 2 individuals were arrested on June the 8th of 2021 for stealing her car and moving it to the area where it was eventually found by the police. The theft had reportedly thrown off the authorities' initial search efforts and prolonged the investigation. The most common theory regarding Erica's fatal road trip is that she'd suffered some sort of mental breakdown, stemming from the stress of shutting down her business and homeschooling her son. What exactly led to her death, however, remains a mystery. Number 5. The Thoughtapili Family. Sandeep and Shmirer Thougapili of Santa Clarita, California, had taken their 2 children, 12-year-old Siddhant and Sachi, aged 9, on a family road trip up to Portland, Oregon, in late March of 2018. After spending a week there, they planned on meeting up with family in San Jose during the drive back home. The Thottapilis never showed up, however, and their relatives hadn't heard from them in 2 days. They reported the family missing to local police. Just a day earlier, witnesses had mentioned seeing a car descend into the Eel River off of Highway 101. There had been torrential downpours and the vehicle slipped off the road, falling down an embankment and landing in the water. The authorities soon realized the car belonged to the Thottapilis. After 2 bodies were recovered from the scene of the crash, the victims were positively identified as Sandeep and Sachi, but Shmirer and Siddhant were still missing. The river's heavy currents had taken them 6 miles downstream, where their remains were eventually found. The site of the Thottapili family's tragic accident was located just 30 miles from the area of the Eel River, where another deadly crash had occurred just 1 month prior. Number 4. Joseph Sivith and Amanda Caldwell. The families of 30-year-old Joseph Sivith and Amanda Caldwell, aged 29, were thrust into a tailspin of panic when the couple mysteriously went missing in January of 2019. Suspicions arose after Caldwell, a resident of Greensburg, Pennsylvania, had failed to show up to work on the morning of Thursday, the 3rd. She hadn't called off of her shift and her cell phone was later found in her apartment. Her friends and co-workers claimed it was quite unusual for her to cut off communication and abandon her phone in such a manner. Caldwell's family quickly reported her missing. Sivith's whereabouts were also unknown at the time, as he had called out of work early Thursday morning. He too was reported missing by his family, and an investigation was then launched by Greensburg police. They had very little information to go on, but they were able to track the use of Caldwell's credit card to a small town close to Charleston, South Carolina, which was roughly 600 miles south of her home in Greensburg. It was speculated that Caldwell had been kidnapped by her boyfriend when Sivith's car was found parked behind her home, and the police found traces of blood on its steering wheel. Both families feared for the worst. Their concerns dissipated, however, when an interstate search for the couple resulted in them being found on a so-called spontaneous vacation in South Carolina. The blood on Sivith's steering wheel had apparently come from a cut on his hand. While everyone was relieved to find the couple alive and well, some called the Greensburg Police Department's actions into question, saying their search efforts were premature, especially considering the missing persons were 2 adults. Number 3. Harry Devitt. The dismembered body of 32-year-old New York native Harry Devitt was found on the side of the road in a small desert town in Mexico. In July of 2014, just 6 months prior, Devitt had been reported missing by his girlfriend. The last contact she'd had with him was in the form of a chilling text where Devitt said he was being escorted out of an area that was too dangerous for him to be in. He was riding his motorcycle from his home in the US all the way down to Brazil for the 2014 World Cup, but had gotten caught up in a section of Mexico fraught with gang violence and drug cartel activity. According to a Mexican newspaper called Excelsior, Devitt was kidnapped by a gang called Los Guerreros and was subsequently murdered. His severed body parts were put into multiple trash bags, and he was left next to the road alongside his bike and bags filled with marijuana and cocaine. It's unclear whether Los Guerreros had tried to sell Devitt these drugs, as such illegal transactions are known to occur between Mexican gangs and American tourists. Devitt had been documenting his journey on a website called A New Yorker Travels. He'd hoped to chronicle his intercontinental adventure from beginning to end, but the tragic conclusion to his story came far sooner than he could have anticipated. Number 2. Ryan Boken and Molly Bach. Frantic friends and family of a couple from South Salt Lake, Utah, reported them missing to local police on April the 17th of 2019. Ryan Boken and Molly Bach, a pair of recently engaged 27-year-olds, had suddenly disappeared without a trace. The cars were not in the driveway, while their dog, a pit bull named Sadie, was gone as well. Concerned friends' attempts to contact the couple proved futile. Ryan's phone had been turned off, and Molly's was left behind at their home. Missing persons flyers were distributed all throughout the couple's neighborhood and other parts of South Salt Lake. The police eventually located Molly's car and towed it to the station as evidence. Just as the investigation was starting to produce results, the couple was found in Arizona. They had taken an unplanned road trip down south to visit family and hadn't told anyone about it. News of their safety spread through their local community, much to the relief of loved ones who'd been worried about their whereabouts. Number 1. The Trump family. In late August of 2016, the Trump family packed up their car and headed out into the scenic Australian countryside. To the outside world, it appeared to be a pleasant getaway, but as members of the Trump family started randomly appearing one by one in different locations around the country, the truth behind their sudden excursion began to reveal itself. As it turns out, the Trump parents, 51-year-old Mark and 53-year-old Jacoba, had grown increasingly unstable in the months and weeks leading up to their road trip. The couple ran a successful landscaping company in a little town just outside of Melbourne, and also operated a profitable red currant farm on their property. They had created a good life for themselves and their 3 children, Rihanna, Mitchell, and Ella, all of whom were in their 20s at the time of the family trip. The financial security that the Trumps had obtained through their various business ventures became a gateway for them to develop the delusion that someone was after them and their money. They truly believed that they were in imminent danger, so they fled. They left behind everything that might be used to track their location, including credit cards and cell phones. Their son Mitchell thought his parents were being irrational, but he went along with them to make sure they stayed safe. He smuggled his phone aboard the car, but once his parents discovered this, they forced him to toss it out the window. After traveling with them for roughly 500 miles, Mitchell asked to be dropped off in a town near Sydney. Later that same day, the 2 daughters, Rihanna and Ella, left their parents behind, stole a car, and drove to the nearest town. They reported their parents as missing to local authorities. Ella returned home shortly thereafter, and she became the first member of the Trump family to be located since their abrupt disappearance. Mitchell arrived home a day later. Rihanna was ultimately found by a truck driver who had discovered her stowed away in the back of his vehicle. She had suffered some sort of psychological trauma, as she had trouble telling the driver who she was or what had happened to her. At some point along the way, Mark and Jacoba had gotten separated themselves. Jacoba was spotted wandering aimlessly through a Victorian town, dazed and confused, while her husband wasn't found until a few days later. By this time, an interstate search for the missing Trumps had been set in motion, and Mark was eventually found lying on the side of the road near Wangaratta Airport. The case of the missing Trump family had become a national curiosity. Over the course of the week-long search, there were a number of theories and rumors in circulation as to why they had left their home in the first place. Some thought chemicals on their farm had severely altered their grasp on reality, prompting them to flee in a panic. The police proposed that the family had suffered some sort of sheer delusion. Nobody knows what really happened to cause such mental distress to an entire family. That's why it's been referred to as one of the most bizarre public meltdowns of modern times. But the Trumps themselves have since done their best to move on and return to their normal lives as if nothing had ever happened.
Number 6. Brawl in Perth. In December of 2021, a massive brawl broke out during a screening of Spider-Man No Way Home at the Hoyt Cinema in the Karrinyup shopping centre of Perth, Australia. The authorities were still investigating the incident as of the latest updates on the matter, but the row, which was captured on video, was reported to have commenced as security guards attempted to remove a man from the theatre. He was allegedly part of a group that had been causing a disturbance by yelling profanities and throwing items at other moviegoers. The melee, which sprawled out into the aisles, ultimately came to involve at least 10 people, with other audience members gathering to watch it unfold. A security guard was injured as a result but declined an ambulance. 2 men aged 19 and 20 were each charged with endangering the life, health, or safety of a person and disorderly conduct. Hoyts released a statement condemning the behavior of the group, who'd incited the brawl and claiming that they'd be permanently banned. Number 5. Attempted murder of Adam Lucero. 21-year-old Adam Lucero of Pasadena, California, was watching The Shallows at a movie theater in Santa Rosa in late June of 2016 in an unexpected and unprovoked attack. The man sitting behind him in the darkened theater began stabbing him repeatedly with a large chef's knife. The assailant would be later identified as Lalonde Hart, age 23. Lucero reportedly fought for his life and struggled to repel Hart's onslaught. The attacker fled the theater and other moviegoers tended to Lucero as they waited for an ambulance. He was left in critical condition, having suffered a punctured lung and injuries to his neck, arm, and ear. Lucero was hospitalized for 2 weeks and the stabbing wound to his throat damaged his voice box, slurring his speech. He could barely walk and suffered from post-traumatic stress in the aftermath. The police found the knife at the scene, the make and model of which they traced to a Macy's store. More gruesome revelations followed. After shoplifting the knife and 3 days before attacking Lucero, Hart had killed Sirac Mateos Tesfazi, aged 22, on Riley Street. The man had been camped out on the street and Hart stabbed him at least 50 times with a knife identical to the one found in a trash can at the movie theater. Hart was identified through surveillance footage and arrested. Investigators found Tesfazi's blood on his clothing and also lifted his fingerprints from the murder weapon. Hart was initially found mentally unfit to stand trial and sent to Napa State Hospital. Once his competence was restored, his trial was set in motion and he pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and attempted murder in November of 2018. He was given 15 years to life for the former and 12 years for the latter, sentences that were to be served consecutively, not concurrently. Number 4. Murder of Anthony Barahaf and Kylie Goodrich. On July the 26th of 2021, TikTok influencer Anthony Barahaf, age 19, was on a first date with 18-year-old Kylie Goodrich at a movie theater in Corona, California. They had dinner and at 9:35 went to see The Forever Purge, a movie about a national holiday in which all criminal activity, including murder, is legal for a day. Aside from the 2 teens, there was only a group of 4 young men in the theater, one of whom was 20-year-old Joseph Jimenez. His friends ultimately left because Jimenez was acting strangely, reportedly by mumbling and talking to himself, and after he'd led them to believe that he was armed. Only he, Barahaf, and Goodrich remained in the theater. During the movie, he shot both teens in the head, execution style, at point-blank range. They sustained critical gunshot injuries and were found by cleaning staff at around 11:35 p.m. Goodrich, a student at Grand Canyon University, was pronounced dead at the scene, while Barahaf was put on a life support and ultimately passed away a few days later. Jimenez had no prior connection to his victims, and the shooting was determined to have been completely random. Riverside County Sheriff's deputies tracked him down through the friend who'd bought the movie tickets. Upon their arrival at his home, a trailer in El Cerrito, deputies saw Jimenez yelling and waving a gun. They took him into custody without incident and determined that his weapon matched the caliber of slugs found at the crime scene. Mental illness was reported as a factor in the shooting, as Jimenez, a schizophrenia sufferer who hadn't been taking his medication, told the media he'd heard voices in his head telling him his loved ones would be killed if he didn't shoot the teens. He was charged with murder and a special circumstance of lying in wait that made him eligible for the death penalty. Number 3. Atik Rafiq. Englishman Atik Rafiq and his wife Aisha Sada went to Birmingham's Star City Cinema on March the 9th of 2019. The 24-year-old bought seats in gold class for screen 17 and at some point during the movie couldn't find his keys and phone. He knelt down and began searching for them with the seat's motorized footrest in a raised position. Rafiq went under the seat and the footrest then automatically started lowering on his neck. An engineering expert later performed tests on the chair and determined that the father of one's neck had been compressed with roughly 3/4 of a ton of pressure. Sada tried to stop the footrest but couldn't identify the buttons to operate it. 10 to 15 minutes had passed before the moviegoer was released, at which point he turned blue and was in critical condition. Rafiq died at Heartlands Hospital on March the 16th. After suffering a catastrophic lack of oxygen to his brain. An inquest was carried out and the cinema was fined over $1 million in 2021 after admitting to have failed in assessing the risks associated with the motorized chair. A judge described it as an accident that never should have happened, and the court was told that the reclining chair had been missing a bar that would have allowed Rafiq to be freed manually. Number 2. Kerry Carmen. In 2018, a woman and her father were charged with endangering the welfare of a child following an incident in which the former had dumped her popcorn on a stranger's toddler. 25-year-old Kerry Carmen and her father Charles, aged 61, were watching Star Wars: The Last Jedi at a theater in Long Island, New York on January the 2nd. Sitting next to Carmen was Celia Riggs and her 2-year-old daughter Harley. At one point during the PG-13 movie, Harley asked her mother for some popcorn. As later reported by Riggs, her child had barely uttered the word when Carmen clamped her hand around Harley's mouth and then dumped her $8.99 popcorn container on the child's head. Carmen's aggressive outburst also reportedly involved her cursing at 28-year-old Riggs. The mother ran out with her child after she'd started crying, while Carmen and her father left in the meantime. Riggs then took to social media to share the incident and asked for help towards identifying those involved. The police were able to track them down through surveillance footage and ticket receipts. In March, Carmen was taken into custody and charged, as was her father, for not stopping the incident. Number 1. Aurora movie theater shooting. On July the 20th of 2012, several hundred people gathered in Theater 6 of the Cinema 16 multiplex in Aurora, Colorado for a midnight screening of The Dark Knight Rises. Roughly 20 minutes into the Batman movie, James Egan Holmes exited the theater through an emergency door. At 12:30 a.m., he returned to Theater 6 heavily armed and armored. He was equipped with a load-bearing vest, a ballistic helmet, and a gas mask, in addition to a bulletproof throat guard, a groin protector, and bulletproof leggings. Moviegoers initially thought he was part of a prank, a publicity stunt for the movie's premiere, or that he was simply in costume, as many of those in attendance were at the time. 24-year-old Holmes, who was reportedly listening to techno music in his headphones to drown out what was to come, then threw a gas canister obstructing the moviegoers' vision, while also irritating their throats, skin and eyes. He then fired a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun, first into the ceiling and then into the crowd. Holmes also shot an AR-15 style semi-automatic rifle with a 100-round drum magazine, but it eventually jammed, prompting him to switch to a 40 caliber Glock 22 pistol. As the shooting unfolded, Holmes concentrated his fire to the back of the room and then to those in the aisles. 3 people in the adjacent Theater 8, which was showing the same movie, were also hit when a bullet pierced through the wall. Through his combined use of the 3 weapons, Holmes had fired 76 shots, causing 58 people to sustain bullet-related injuries. 12 of them ultimately passed away, including 4 men in their 20s, who died at the scene reportedly while protecting their girlfriends from the gunfire. In the aftermath, one victim became a paraplegic and another suffered extensive brain damage from a shotgun blast to the head and was left unable to speak or move properly. Law enforcement rushed to the scene and arrived less than 2 minutes after the first calls had been placed. Holmes was apprehended without incident next to his car behind the cinema. Experts identified Holmes' mental illness, schizoaffective disorder, as a significant factor behind the massacre, but he was deemed to have been legally sane at the time of the shooting. Prosecutors sought the death penalty, but the jury, who found Holmes guilty on multiple counts of murder and attempted murder, couldn't unanimously agree on it. The mass murderer was sentenced to 12 consecutive life sentences, plus 3,318 years without parole. Number 10. Andy Llewellyn. In 2017, Andy Llewellyn was attacked by a bird of prey as he was jogging down Infinity Park Way in Derby, England. He didn't see it, but only heard the flapping of wings on his shoulder as the buzzard plunged its talons into his head. After the attack, Llewellyn started running in fear and later claimed that, ironically, he made his fastest time. He was left with 2 bloody marks that ran lengthwise atop his skull. When he went to a clinic, the doctors who treated the deep wounds claimed they'd never heard of such an attack. Indeed, an ornithologist agreed that such aggressive behavior was rare. The theory was that Llewellyn had probably run too close to a nest and thus had been attacked by a protective parent. Number 9. Craig Sitzma. In July of 2014, jogger Craig Sitzman was mauled to death by a pair of dogs in Michigan's Metamora Township. The 46-year-old cancer survivor had run a little over a mile on Thomas Road when the 100-pound Cane Corsos attacked him. They pulled Sitzma into a grassy ditch and viciously bit him in the arms, legs, chest, and back. The man struggled for his life and screamed for help. As the dogs retreated, a neighbor rushed to his aid, using her belt as a tourniquet on his left arm to stop the bleeding. Sitzma started succumbing to blood loss and the neighbor attempted to revive him with CPR. However, she was forced to retreat when the dogs returned, and the man passed away from his injuries. The couple who owned the canines was sentenced to nearly 5 years in prison for failing to contain them, even though they had previously bitten other residents. Number 8. Wendy Martinez. On September the 28th of 2018, a woman was stabbed to death near Washington, D.C.'s Logan Circle neighborhood. 35-year-old Wendy Martinez, who'd recently gotten engaged, was jogging in a busy and well-lit part of the city, only 3 blocks from where she lived. The attack took place at around 8 p.m. Roughly 20 minutes prior, 23-year-old Anthony Crawford had stolen a knife from a local grocery store. He approached Martinez and stabbed her multiple times. The woman managed to get away and staggered into a Chinese takeout restaurant. Others rushed to help her as she collapsed to the ground. The attack had caused severe damage to several of her vital organs, and Martinez failed to recover. Crawford had stabbed the woman at random and gave no reason for his actions. A psychologist deemed him fit to stand trial for first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Number 7. Yovi Suarez Jimenez. In the spring of 2006, a woman was killed and partially eaten by an alligator in Florida. Yovi Suarez Jimenez, a 28-year-old biology student, was jogging near a canal close to her dormitory community, north of Fort Lauderdale. According to the woman's mother, who'd spoken to her prior to the attack, Jimenez was depressed. While no one saw the alligator take her, a witness claimed to have seen Jimenez dangling her feet in the water over the canal's edge. The attack was extremely brutal, and according to a medical examiner, she was already dead by the time the beast pulled her into the water. Jimenez was bitten on the leg and back, while the predatory animal had also basically amputated both her arms. After she was found floating face down in the canal, a search for the alligator was launched. After 4 days, trappers caught the 350-pound beast, and it took nearly 5 men to drag it out of the water. The alligator's stomach was opened up and parts of the victim's arms were found inside. The animal was blind in one eye, which trappers believed might have enhanced its aggression. Number 6. Danielle Brosui and Patricia Herlinger. In the fall of 2019, Danielle Brosui and her mother, Mary Kelly, were jogging through Spring Grove Cemetery in Cincinnati. Joining them was 55-year-old Patricia Herlinger. At some point during their run, rain started to fall and a security guard reportedly offered them a ride. The women declined, and as the guard drove away, he heard the crackling of thunder and saw a lightning flash. When the man returned, both Herlinger and 27-year-old Brosui were on the ground, with Kelly struggling to revive them. The women had been struck by lightning and suffered severe heart damage. Brosui was rushed to the emergency room, where she was pronounced dead later that day. Herlinger also succumbed to her injuries a few days later. Number 5. Dave Stevens. On October the 12th of 2015, Dave Stevens was jogging along White Rock Creek Trail in Dallas County, Texas. The 55-year-old had run several miles before he was attacked by a man with a machete and brutally hacked to death. The killer was 21-year-old Thomas Lins Johnson, a former college football player for Texas A&M. Despite a promising career, Johnson had walked away from his team a few years prior. After butchering Stevens, he called the police and told them that an individual was lying down with a sword stuck in his head. When the authorities arrived, Johnson told them he'd just committed capital murder. The man didn't know his victim and claimed that he'd been looking for someone to kill because he was angry about being homeless. According to his family, Johnson heard voices in his head, and doctors would later diagnose him with schizophrenia. Number 4. Larry Adams. In August of 2020, a man was jogging on Utah's Antelope Island when he had a fatal encounter with a wild animal. According to the Utah Department of Natural Resources, the man was alone and calling for help when 2 women found him. They called 911 and, along with park rangers, administered first aid. The man was taken to a hospital where he succumbed to his injuries later that day. 55-year-old Larry Adams had a self-described love and passion for the island. He'd posted to his social media about the hundreds of bison he'd encountered during his runs and urged other joggers to be cautious. Unfortunately, in spite of the wide berth he'd given the beasts, Adams's life would ultimately be claimed by one of them. The runner's injuries were consistent with a bison goring, and he had lacerations, which supported him having been thrown around by the animal, which can weigh over a ton. Number 3. Candice Burner. In 2010, 32-year-old Candice Burner was fatally mauled while jogging near the small village of Chignik Lake, Alaska. Burner, who was originally from Slippery Rock, Pennsylvania, had come to the village to teach children with special needs. In March 2010, she was out for a run near the remote community where she encountered 2 or more wolves. It's unclear whether she'd surprised the beasts or if they'd been actively hunting her. Whatever the case might have been, the woman was fatally attacked and partially eaten by the animals. Wolf tracks were found around her mangled body. Wolf DNA recovered from Burner's clothing was later matched to that from wolves shot in the area. None of the animals suffered from rabies. Wildlife authorities couldn't determine why the attack had occurred, but argued that Burner was certainly treated like prey in the aftermath. One of the theories proposed that the beasts had become habituated to human presence and thus had gradually lost their fear of them. It's fathomable that to a hungry pack, Boken, who was slightly under 5 feet tall, could have seemed like an easy target. Number 2. Ali Brugger. On July the 30th of 2016, a woman was gunned down during her daily jog in Oakland County, Michigan. 31-year-old Ali Brugger was running along Fish Lake Road in the village of Holly when someone shot her in the back 4 times in broad daylight. Brugger collapsed on the front yard of a nearby house and residents called the authorities.
There's a girl laying in my yard that just got shot a couple times.
Okay, she got shot?
Yes. Laying face down, she's bleeding all over the place. I gotta get out there and see if I can help her.
The young woman who worked as a nurse succumbed to the severe injury she sustained in the shooting. The injury had taken place roughly 2 miles from the woman's home, and her father, a Vietnam veteran, referred to it as an assassination. Brugger's mother told the authorities that she wasn't aware of her having had problems with anyone. The authorities couldn't rule out either parent as a suspect since they were each other's alibi, as they both claimed to have been at home when their daughter was gunned down. They were eventually cleared, and the father even passed a polygraph test. Brugger's death as of January 2021 remains a mystery. The police suspect that the victim knew her killer, with the exception of a light-colored 4-door sedan spotted in the area around the time of the shooting. There still aren't many reported leads regarding the woman's death. Number 1. Todd Beavers. In July of 2019, Florida man Curtis Miller was arrested and charged with second-degree attempted murder for swinging a sword at a jogger. Miller was searching through a pile of trash outside a vacant Oakland Park home. Jogger Todd Beavers was passing through and found a plastic 4-wheel cart, which he decided to take home. Miller and Beavers had an exchange of words, with the former claiming he had dibs on the discarded item. Beavers disagreed and took the cart. He made it to his front lawn, but upon turning around he saw Miller coming towards him with the unsheathed weapon. Both men started pulling on the cart, with Miller swinging the sword at Beavers several times. Fortunately, none of the strikes connected. He was forced to retreat when the jogger let him know the brawl was being recorded by the surveillance system of his home. Miller was later arrested while the cart's initial owner, who saw that the men had been fighting over it, retrieved it from Beavers. Number 8. Judith Garrett. In September of 2014, 29-year-old Judith Garrett of Northumberland, England, was attending a cycling race in North Wales when the accident occurred. She was there in support of her boyfriend, a competitor in the race, when a cyclist lost control at the bottom of the downhill course, sending his bike hurtling into the crowd. It struck Garrett and launched her back into a tree. She suffered major head injuries as a result of the impact and had to be airlifted to a nearby hospital, where she passed away the following day. Concerns were subsequently raised regarding the safety measures taken by the event's organizers and race marshals on the day of the competition. The steep course sent cyclists racing past crowds at speeds of up to 40 miles per hour. There were separation shoulders installed along the route to ensure attendees didn't stand too close to the raceway. Following Garrett's death, some questioned whether the shoulders were wide enough. A marshal present at the scene of the accident, the race organizer, and the British Cycling Federation were all brought to court on health and safety charges. They were, however, each found not guilty of any wrongdoing. Number 7. Jonathan Denver. 24-year-old Jonathan Denver of Fort Bragg, Northern California, attended a game between the Los Angeles Dodgers and the San Francisco Giants at AT&T Park on September the 25th of 2013. He was there with his brother and his father, a Dodgers security guard, supporting the LA club in San Francisco's home stadium. The trio left early,
as it had become apparent that a Giants win was imminent, and they decided to go to a bar downtown. At roughly 11:30 that night, they left the bar and got involved in a dispute with a group of people leaving a nightclub. Denver had heckled the clubbers because they were wearing San Francisco Giants attire, and an argument broke out with Michael Montgomery, age 21. After a loud but relatively innocuous shouting match, tensions between the two parties had started to die down. The fight was soon rekindled, however. Authorities were unsure of who'd instigated the second spat, but it ultimately escalated into a physical altercation. Denver and his brother attacked Montgomery, at some point reportedly hitting him over the head with a chair. In the ensuing scuffle, Denver was fatally stabbed. In the investigation that followed, Montgomery was arrested on suspicion of murdering Denver that night. However, San Francisco District Attorney George Gascon eventually cleared him of all charges, concluding that there wasn't definitive evidence to disprove Montgomery's assertion that he was acting in self-defense when he'd stabbed Denver. Number 6. The Bradford City Stadium Fire. During an English League 3rd Division football match between Bradford City and Lincoln City on May the 11th of 1985, a careless spectator attempted to put out his cigarette on the floor of the bleachers, but it slipped through a small crack in the stands. He and his son noticed that smoke had begun to rise from the area it had fallen into, so they poured coffee down there in an attempt to extinguish any potential flame. The plume of smoke only grew larger, so they left to notify a stadium steward. There was a buildup of garbage sitting below the stands which had caught fire when the cigarette fell down there. By the time the man and his son returned with the attendant, a fire had already engulfed their section of the stands. Due to uncharacteristically windy conditions that day, the blaze engulfed the entire stadium within 4 minutes. Large masses of spectators attempted to flee the arena, but many of the exit doors and turnstiles had been locked upon the start of the match. A number of fans were burned alive as they attempted to break through the locked exits. Those in the crowd who'd rushed the field successfully escaped the fire, while many others were trapped in their seats. The fire brigade raced to the stadium, arriving 4 minutes after being notified of the situation. Rescuers struggled to get to the source of the fire, and it took many hours for them to extinguish the flames and retrieve all of the bodies. The fire resulted in 56 deaths and 265 non-fatal injuries. The incident led to widespread safety reforms, and UK stadiums were no longer allowed to use wooden grandstands. A total sum of roughly £20 million was awarded in court to 154 people injured or bereaved by the fire. The identity of the man who initially started the deadly blaze has never officially been confirmed. Number 5. The Spearman Parachuting Accident. On October the 4th of 1996, a freak accident took the life of a woman at a high school football game in Spearman, Texas. As part of the pre-game ceremonies, a pair of parachutists planned to jump from an airplane and land at midfield with the game ball in hand. Unexpected winds sent one of them off course, and they lost control of the descent as they drew nearer to the field. 2 additional crew members, a husband and wife duo, stood at ground level to catch the others in the event that one of them required assistance with their landing. Unfortunately, the ground crew wasn't paying attention to the wayward parachutists, who subsequently landed directly on top of them. The woman was left unconscious on the sideline for several minutes while a medical professional attempted to resuscitate her. She was subsequently taken to a hospital but died later that night. Her husband suffered a broken arm but was otherwise outside of any real danger. Number 4. The Ellis Park Stadium Disaster. Ellis Park Stadium in Johannesburg, South Africa, was the location of a highly anticipated soccer match between the Kaizer Chiefs and the Orlando Pirates, a storied rivalry within the sport, known to draw massive crowds. On April the 11th of 2001, an unprecedented number of spectators made desperate attempts to gain access to the stadium. While the arena's crowd capacity maxed out at 60,000, there were reports that as many as 120,000 people pushed their way inside that day. As a result of the uncontrollable flow of fans, many found themselves trapped beneath the stampede of people rushing to get inside. In an attempt to quell the crowd, security guards fired tear gas canisters into them, but it only made matters worse as panic ensued. The crush resulted in a multitude of injuries and claimed the lives of 43 people. The match was stopped after stadium officials received news of the extensive casualties. All spectators were then sent away so that the victims could be identified and medical attention could be given to those wounded. In the aftermath of the tragic event, authorities discovered that some of the stadium attendants had been bribed to let in more people than was allowed. The disaster was the deadliest sporting accident in South African history, surpassing a 1991 incident that resulted in 42 deaths at a match between the same two teams. Number 3. Justin Hayes and Ronald Lee Homer. On May the 21st of 2008, a baseball spectator at Turner Field in Atlanta, Georgia, fell roughly 60 feet from his seat in the stadium's upper deck, plummeting to the ground-level concourse positioned behind home plate. Justin Hayes, aged 25, was attending a game between the hometown Atlanta Braves and the visiting New York Mets when his fatal fall occurred. He had reportedly attempted to slide down the banister of a stairwell when he lost control and went over the edge of the upper deck safety railing. He suffered major injuries to his head as a result of the fall, and although he was transported to Grady Memorial Hospital, there was nothing that could be done to save his life. The police believed alcohol had been a factor in the accident. An eerily similar incident occurred just a few years later, when 29-year-old Ronald Lee Homer fell to his death from Turner Field's upper deck on August the 12th of 2013. Homer's autopsy revealed that his blood alcohol level was roughly twice the legal limit at the time of the fall. His death was eventually ruled a suicide. Homer had previously talked about Justin Hayes' fatal accident with a friend who had begun to suspect that he was having thoughts of self-harm. Number 2. Shannon Stone. During a Major League Baseball game at Rangers Ballpark in Arlington, Texas, a 39-year-old firefighter died in front of his young son. Brownwood resident Shannon Stone had taken his son to a game between the Texas Rangers and the Oakland Athletics on July the 7th of 2011. Rangers' outfielder Josh Hamilton threw a baseball up to Stone in the stands as a souvenir. As he reached out to catch it, Stone leaned over the railing that separates the bleachers from the field. He lost his balance and fell. The firefighter dropped roughly 20 feet and landed on the concrete below. While he survived the initial impact, his condition deteriorated rapidly as he was being transported to a Fort Worth hospital. Within an hour of the fall, he was pronounced dead. Hamilton was distraught upon hearing the news of Stone's passing. The locker rooms for both teams were closed off to reporters after the game, as many of the players were reportedly shaken up by the incident. Number 1. Sabrina Patty. 39-year-old Sabrina Patty of Tampa, Florida, an elementary school teacher and mother of 2, wanted to do something special for her hockey-loving family. The woman and her 2 sons were die-hard supporters of the Tampa Bay Lightning, so she and her husband brought them to their first professional hockey game on April the 14th of 2018. It was a playoff match between the Lightning and the New Jersey Devils at the Amalie Arena in Tampa. Professional hockey stadiums have safety nets installed in order to catch the puck should it careen into the stands. The Patties were sitting in the area where the safety net comes to an end, and there are no protective implements in place. During the game, the puck was launched over the net and into the stands, striking Patty directly in the face. She was taken to a medical area within the facility in order for her injuries to be examined and later transported to Tampa General Hospital. She experienced numbness in the left side of her face, a black eye, and a painful knot on her forehead. Fortunately, Patty survived the incident, and a spokesman for the Lightning issued an apology on behalf of the team. Her attorney claimed that she could have easily lost her eye in the accident and insisted the arena update its safety protocols. However, it's worth noting that fans who attend NHL games enter an agreement that absolves the stadium and the team of any liability for potential injuries. Number 8. Steve Palmer. In 2020, a man from Birmingham, England, contracted flesh-eating bacteria while gardening and nearly lost his hand. 34-year-old Steve Palmer had been clearing flood damage from his garden with the help of his wife and 2 young sons. He suffered a small scratch to his hand, which he didn't think much of at first. By the following morning, however, he was no longer able to move his finger and, later in the day, suffered throbbing pains and a fever. He'd contracted necrotizing fasciitis, a rare bacterial infection with a high mortality rate that eats away at flesh and progresses very quickly. 24 hours after the initial scratch, Palmer was experiencing what he described as the worst pain he'd ever felt, as the flesh on the back of his hand had begun to rot away. He was transported for specialist care at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Birmingham, where doctors were successful in stopping the infection from spreading. Palmer was in surgery for nearly 5 hours as staff worked to clear the dead tissue in an effort to save his hand. They subsequently started reconstructing it by grafting flesh
from further up the arm. Palmer was quoted as saying, "I can't believe something like this could happen from gardening," and in the aftermath, urged others to wear gardening gloves and clean every injury, no matter how small. Number 7. Vesta Chinobenia. In November of 2014, 48-year-old Vesta Chinobenia and her husband Zoran were gardening at their home in Casula in Sydney's southwest. A neighbor reported that a heated argument had broken out between the two. Then the neighbor heard Vesna scream and afterwards saw her lying motionless on the ground, with Zoran standing near her body. It would later be revealed that the 52-year-old had strangled his wife to death. Zoran then drove off and used Vesna's cell phone to call their son, reportedly telling him, "Alex, I've killed your mum." He was arrested upon his return to the residence. He had scratches to his hands, shoulders, neck, and face, which Vesna had inflicted as she fought for her life. According to the police, they'd been called to their Flame Tree Street home prior to the incident. It was later determined that the argument had been about Zoran's mental health, with reports indicating he'd been admitted to a number of facilities in the past. A physical struggle ensued and Vesna desperately tried to get away from her husband. By Zoran's recollection of the events, he caught her and they started to fight, at which point he just jumped her. He claimed that he couldn't remember much beyond that point. He was ultimately found not guilty of killing his wife by reason of mental illness and was scheduled for psychiatric evaluation, which would establish when he'd be fit for release. Number 6. Teresa Edwards. In July of 2016, a woman from West Sussex, England suffered a gruesome accident while gardening alongside her husband. 59-year-old Teresa Edwards was using a lawnmower to cut thigh-high grass. She reached down to unclog the machine but accidentally placed her hand between the box and the blade. The lawnmower severed off 3 of her fingertips. The shock initially prevented her from feeling any pain, and as she removed her gardening glove, Edwards saw blood gushing from her open wounds. To stop the blood from pumping into her fingers, she raised her arm in the air above the heart level. Her husband started looking for the severed tips as they waited for the ambulance. One was recovered from the grass, while the other 2 were found by paramedics in the lawnmower's box. Edwards was rushed to the trauma unit of the Queen Victoria Hospital in East Grinstead. While there, she was given a choice of amputation or of having the fingertips reattached. The cuts that the lawnmower blade had inflicted weren't clean, which is why reattachment only had a 50% chance of success. It would involve a 15-hour surgery, a recovery period of at least a year, and having leeches attached to her fingers that would drain the blood so that she could regain movement. Amputation, which Edwards ultimately opted for, could be performed the following day under a local anesthetic and with a much shorter rehab period. In the months following the amputation, Edwards suffered from pain in addition to depression and anxiety, as she constantly relived the moment of her life-changing injury. Number 5. Sue Bramley. In October of 2013, detectives arrived at the home of Sue Bramley in Mansfield, Nottinghamshire, asking permission to dig up her garden, claiming an incident had occurred. Bramley had moved into the home 8 years prior, and the garden was one of her favorite things about it. On one patch of land, however, grass wouldn't grow, and the woman turned it into a bed for her teenage daughter to plant flowers. It was that area of the garden where police dogs first headed as they were brought on the premises. The authorities also used a digger, and by the end of the day, a horrific truth emerged. Inside a shallow grave, they found the bodies of former owners Patricia and William Wycherley. The elderly couple had been gunned down in 1998 by their daughter, Susan, and her husband, Christopher Edwards. On the day of the double murder, neighbors would report seeing Christopher up to his waist digging in the garden. The bodies were wrapped in duvets and dumped in the grave. For 15 years, the killers made it seem that the Wycherleys were still alive, forging letters and documents so that they could collect their pensions. The couple stole nearly £300,000 from their victims but didn't have a lavish lifestyle, spending most of the money on movie memorabilia and authenticated autographs of celebrities they admired. They regularly traveled to the house to maintain the garden, presumably concerned that someone would uncover their crimes, but eventually sold it. Susan and Christopher turned themselves in after fleeing to France and amassing considerable debt. and were each sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 25 years served. In spite of the garden's dark history, Bramley and her daughter were determined not to move. Number 4. John Claiborne. In April of 2021, Australian TV director John Claiborne died in a freak gardening accident at his home in Atamon on Sydney's North Shore. 52-year-old Claiborne had over 3 decades experience in television and was known for his work on popular series Home and Away and Underbelly. When the incident occurred, he was using a cordless power saw to trim the hedges in his garden. His wife, Melissa, was in the kitchen when she heard a branch breaking and rushed outside. She found Claiborne crawling on his stomach and clutching his torso, with blood gushing from his hand. He'd somehow cut into his hand with the power tool and then plummeted nearly 10 feet from the ladder. Ambulances arrived at his home and rushed Claiborne to Royal North Shore Hospital, where he passed away after going into cardiac arrest from severe blood loss. He was survived by his wife and 2 sons. Number 3. Ellen Bador. In August of 2021, an elderly Cleveland woman nearly lost her life after being caught in the crossfire during a drive-by and a shootout in the neighborhood of Cadell. At the time, 74-year-old Ellen Bador was picking weeds from the garden in her front yard. Witnesses reported that at around 2 p.m., a car pulled up on a group that was playing basketball in the street. The occupants of the vehicle started shooting at them, and the basketball players returned fire. A 19-year-old man was shot in the street, while 2 people in the car, also reported as being in their late teens, also sustained gunshot injuries. None of those involved in the shootout have been named, and their condition is unclear. The police offered a $5,000 reward in the aftermath for information that would lead to their prosecution. Bador was taken to the hospital in critical condition after being shot in the hand and abdomen. Family members reported that she needed to have part of her colon and intestine surgically removed. According to the latest updates on the case, medical staff had managed to stabilize her. Number 2. Lucinda Smith. In March of 2015, a mother of 2 from England died after scratching the back of her hand while gardening and developing a dangerous infection. A few days after the minor scrape, 43-year-old Lucinda Smith complained of a pain in her shoulder and went to see a GP. The medical specialist didn't check her blood pressure or test her blood and sent Smith away with a prescription for an antidepressant to relax her muscles and help her sleep, after diagnosing her with a trapped nerve. The woman's condition continued to deteriorate over the next few days, as she was in greater pain with her fingers and arm becoming red and swollen. Smith was eventually admitted to the emergency room at Basildon Hospital. It was there that within 30 minutes a simple blood test revealed she'd contracted sepsis, and doctors immediately started treating her with intravenous antibiotics. Sepsis, a potentially deadly condition, is the body's extreme immune response while trying to fight off an infection, which can reduce the supply of blood to other organs. Had it been detected earlier, Smith would have likely survived. As her organs ceased functioning properly, she succumbed to cardiovascular, renal, and respiratory failure 5 days after injuring her hand in the garden. Number 1. Christopher Kay. In 2020, a man from Carlin Howe in North Yorkshire, England, was fatally shot with an air rifle while tending to his garden. 58-year-old Christopher Kay, described as a dearly loved grandfather by his family, had gone to a hospital appointment and then had lunch with a friend before returning home on August the 21st. Jaime Hellings, a man in his early 30s, was severely intoxicated as he was traveling in a car with 2 friends. Kay was in front of his house working in the garden, which was concealed by a large hedge, when Hellings fired the air rifle out of the car window. The pellet struck Kay in the chest. He called an ambulance and told the operator he'd been shot. Kay was tended to by his neighbors, but by the time he was transported to a Middlesbrough hospital, went into cardiac arrest. Kay passed away, and Hellings, after realizing he'd been responsible for the incident, surrendered to the authorities. He claimed that he'd never meant to fire the rifle and that it had accidentally discharged while he was handling it. He pled guilty to manslaughter and was jailed for 6 years and 8 months. Number 8. Miriam Ducré-Lemay. 20-year-old Miriam Ducré-Lemay from Montreal, Canada, went to her new boyfriend's house to spend the night after they'd gone to a party in 2012. Only days prior, Ducre LeMay had reportedly told her mother, Micheline Ducre, she was in love. The woman would later speak to Journal de Quebec about the moment, recounting, "It's the first time I saw my daughter with such bright eyes." Later that night, the boyfriend went to the kitchen and made himself a snack before he returned to the bedroom and gave Ducre LeMay a kiss. Shortly thereafter, the young woman began having a severe allergic reaction, and within minutes, paramedics arrived to the address. They rushed her to the hospital, but unfortunately, Ducre LeMay's life couldn't be saved. It subsequently emerged that she'd suffered from a life-threatening peanut allergy, of which her boyfriend was unaware. His late-night snack had consisted of a peanut butter sandwich, and as reported by medical experts, traces of allergens can remain in the saliva for up to 4 hours after eating. Ducre LeMay went into anaphylactic shock by coming in contact with the traces of peanuts in her boyfriend's mouth. In the aftermath of the fatal kiss, Ducre shared her daughter's story to raise awareness about the dangers of allergies and the importance of carrying an EpiPen at all times. The epinephrine auto-injector, which Ducre LeMay didn't have with her, works by reversing the effects of anaphylaxis. The latter causes blood pressure to drop dramatically and the airways to constrict. Epinephrine, which is the primary and most effective immediate treatment for allergic reactions, elevates blood pressure and improves flow, relaxing the muscles of airways so a person can breathe. Number 7. Mariel Suarez. In early 2022, an Argentinian judge became the subject of international headlines and a disciplinary investigation following an incident that suggested she was in a relationship with a convicted murderer. Mariel Suarez, from the southern Chubut province, was one of 3 judges on a panel meant to decide whether Christian May Bustos would spend the rest of his life in prison. During a previous trial, Bustos had admitted to fatally shooting police officer Leandro Roberts in 2008. Suarez dissented over his sentence and had sought a more lenient punishment, in spite of him taking responsibility for the killing. About a week later, on December the 29th of 2021, leaked footage from the visiting room of a penitentiary in Trelew sparked wide speculation that Bustos and Suarez were romantically involved. The clip, picked up by multiple local and international news outlets, showed what appeared to have been a kiss shared between the two. An officer on duty also reported to have spotted the pair locking lips inside the room. The judge vehemently denied the existence of a sentimental relationship, claiming that she was only visiting Bustos for research purposes, as she'd been planning to write a book about his case. Should the investigation conclude that Suarez and Bustos had been romantically involved at the time of his sentencing, a potentially career-ending argument could be made that the judge had been biased in her reservations towards a life sentence. Number 6. Incident at Nashville High School. A teacher from the John Overton High School in Nashville, Tennessee, was suspended in 2012 after he threw a bucket of water on a pair of teens that he'd reportedly spotted kissing in the corridor. None of the parties were named, but Maggie Tiefenthal, identified as the mother of the 16-year-old boy involved in the incident, was outraged by the teacher's actions. Speaking to the media about what had transpired, Tiefenthal revealed that her son was upset and embarrassed in the aftermath. She also mentioned that neither her son nor his 17-year-old girlfriend had done anything to be deemed inappropriate. The water dousing incident was captured on the school's CCTV system, and Tiefenthal, as well as the girlfriend's parents, subsequently argued that the teacher could have simply asked the teens to clear the corridor instead of drenching them with water. Tiefenthal was quoted as saying, "They are not dogs. That is what you do to dogs, and they are not animals." In a Facebook post, the teacher admitted to throwing the bucket of water and was unapologetic about his chosen course of action, even remarking upon its supposed efficiency. The school's administrator reviewed the footage and, after finding the educator to have been at fault, temporarily suspended him. Number 5. Courtney Wilson and Taylor Guerrero. While visiting Hawaii in 2015, Los Angeles couple Courtney Wilson and Taylor Guerrero claimed to have been harassed and wrongfully arrested over a public display of affection. According to a lawsuit filed against Honolulu police, the two women had been walking through the aisles of a Foodland store on Oahu's North Shore. At one point, they hugged and kissed, to which Officer Bobby Harrison, who'd been shopping in uniform at the same store, reacted by allegedly telling them to take it somewhere else. The women obliged and moved to a different section of the store. When Harrison saw them again being affectionate with each other, he threatened to have them thrown out. A physical altercation ensued between Harrison and the couple after the officer had grabbed Wilson's wrist while they were in the checkout line. She called 911, but it was her and Guerrero who were ultimately arrested on the felony charge of assault on an officer. The couple spent 3 weeks in jail, and the condition of their subsequent release was that they didn't leave the island. The charges against them were eventually dropped, and in 2016, they were awarded an $80,000 settlement after suing the city of Honolulu. The payout was not to be regarded as an admission of any wrongdoing, and Harrison, who'd retired at the end of the previous year, was dismissed from the lawsuit. The women, who'd broken up but had remained friends since the incident, decided to split the money. By the time the charges against them had been dismissed, Guerrero had chosen to remain in Honolulu, while Wilson returned to Los Angeles. Number 4. Audra Adams. While at the Monkey Bar and Grill in India Atlantic near Melbourne, Florida, a woman tried to kiss a number of random strangers and then repeatedly called the police to complain about a lack of social distancing. The incident happened in May of 2020, while officials in the state were in the midst of trying to contain the coronavirus situation. Other patrons had complained to bar management that 32-year-old Audra Adams was trying to kiss them. Aside from her unwanted and unwarranted advances, there were also health concerns as the virus was said to spread through saliva contact. She was asked to leave, but in spite of her being the one who'd pursued the interactions, Adams then dialed 911 a reported 5 times to complain that those inside the bar weren't in compliance with the statewide preventative measures. By the time of her 4th call, the Melbourne Police Department were already at the scene. Adams reportedly began arguing with the officers, and once she'd finally left the bar, refused to clear out of the parking lot, even though law enforcement warned her that she'd be charged with trespassing. She was eventually booked on the latter, as well as disorderly conduct, resisting an officer without violence, and misuse of the 911 system. The penultimate charge stemmed from her attempting to break free while being escorted to the police car. Number 3. Robin Lee Gentile. In January of 2017, Las Vegas woman Robin Lee Gentile was sentenced to probation for up to 5 years for having an inappropriate relationship with a student while working as a substitute teacher. The incident occurred in late 2015 while she was employed at Harney Middle School. 23-year-old Gentile had been involved in a hip-hop club that included youths from the middle school where she worked and from Las Vegas High. It was through the extracurricular program that she met a high school student, whose name wasn't released, with whom she began having a relationship. Twice a week, she gave him rides from the school to his house. They exchanged hundreds of text messages and kissed at least 5 times in Gentile's car and outside the teen's home. According to her arrest report, Gentile felt powerful kissing the student and had chosen to engage in the illicit affair as revenge against her fiancé for allegedly texting other women. The teen would subsequently claim he'd felt pressured to be in the relationship with the teacher because he wanted to be comfortable while in the school club. Initially sentenced to serve 19 to 48 months, Gentile was eventually given probation in addition to being forced to register as an offender and pay various fines. Number 2. Gemma Benjamin. For several months leading up to April of 2009, University of Wales Institute Cardiff student Gemma Benjamin had been seeing fellow student Daniel Ross, aged 21. They were going out for dinner but had briefly returned to Ross's apartment in Pontypridd, South Wales, so he could retrieve a credit card that he'd forgotten. They were mainly friends and hadn't had a physical relationship up to that point, but ended up sharing a first kiss by the front door. The pair then went inside the apartment where 18-year-old Benjamin sat on a couch. Minutes after they'd kissed, the teenager's eyelids began drooping and her mouth started to froth. Confused and panic-stricken, Ross called the emergency services and was instructed on how to revive Benjamin, who was drifting in and out of consciousness. Unfortunately, in spite of the man's efforts, she didn't recover and died in his arms. It later emerged that the athletic teenager, a keen swimmer and hockey player, had succumbed to a rare heart condition called Sudden Adult Death Syndrome, or SADS. It's caused by a disturbance in the heart's rhythm that affects the electrical functioning of the organ. In the wake of her passing, Benjamin's father criticized what he'd believed to have been a delayed response from the emergency services. However, SAD stems from DNA defects in the heart's electrical system, and cases of death are typically instant. An inquest revealed that there was nothing that Ross or the paramedics could have done to save Benjamin. Number 1. Matt Hancock. In June of 2021, compromising surveillance footage emerged of British Secretary of State for Health Matt Hancock kissing and hugging his aide Gina Coladangelo. Hancock, then in his early 40s, had served as a health secretary since 2018 and had overseen a significant portion of the UK's response to the COVID-19 situation as well as the consequent vaccination program. CCTV images of him and Coladangelo, captured by a camera hidden in the smoke detector of his Whitehall office, were shared by the Sun newspaper. The incident was met with a considerable degree of public ridicule and outrage. The kiss and ensuing scandal not only exposed Hancock and Coladangelo's affair, with both of them being married at the time, but also highlighted the former's failure to abide by the same pandemic regulations he'd urged members of the public to respect. The government's guidelines allowed intimate contact with people from a different household only from May the 17th, but Hancock and Coladangelo, who'd been friends since studying together at Oxford in the 1990s, had been captured kissing more than a week earlier. Moreover, Hancock had failed to declare that he'd hired his mistress to the department in a position for which she annually received thousands of pounds from public funds. On June the 25th, the day that the scandal had broken, Hancock apologized for letting people down by breaching social distancing guidelines. He resigned the following day. Coladangelo did the same, and subsequent reports indicated that she and Hancock had separated from their respective spouses to move in together. Number 10. Benny Davis. In 2020, 57-year-old Benny Davis was riding his bike through a Fort Walton Beach neighborhood in Florida. Suddenly, a man in a Ford pickup truck pulled beside him. Without warning, he aimed a crossbow and shot an arrow into Davis's head. The cyclist was rushed to a local hospital with severe head injuries. According to subsequent reports, Davis was released from the facility after his condition was stabilized. The police identified the car and named the suspected attacker as 42-year-old Matthew Ross Peters. They then spotted the vehicle outside a Seabreeze Inn. Officers established a perimeter, and surveillance showed Peters exiting his room armed with the crossbow. He was arrested without further incident. His motives for shooting the cyclist remain unknown, but he might have been acting under the influence of methamphetamine, which was also found in his possession. Number 9. Paul Toyne. In 2020, a man riding his bike in Greetwell Quarry, England, narrowly avoided death after his neck got impaled on a stick. 32-year-old Paul Toyne was out on his daily exercise routine when he tumbled over a 10-foot cliff. As he fell sideways, a branch that was about as thick as an index finger got lodged in his neck. A friend called the emergency services, and Toyne was airlifted to Hull Royal Infirmary. Doctors successfully removed the stick, which fortunately had missed the major arteries in the man's neck. Toyne was set to make a full recovery after receiving stitches to mend the gaping wound. Number 8. S.J. Brooks. In May of 2018, S.J. Brooks and his friend, Isaac Cedarbaum, were mountain biking on a remote trail outside of Seattle, Washington. The pair, both in their early 30s, were attacked by a mountain lion, also known as a cougar. At first, they'd managed to scare the animal away by making noises and hitting it with the wheels of their bicycles. The cougar ran off, but then circled back and pounced. It brought Cedarbaum to the ground and clamped its jaws on his head. Brooks tried to run away, but by doing so, triggered the cougar's chase instinct. It relinquished the hold on Cedarbaum and went after Brooks instead. Cedarbaum, who had sustained deep wounds from the cougar's claws, rode his bike for 2 miles, trying to get a signal on his phone and call for help. He managed to reach the emergency services.
911, what are you reporting?
Help, I got attacked by a mountain lion. Me and my friend, I'm up in
Where are you?
I don't know where I am.
Where are you?
Oh, I'm near Mount Si. I was following. I went north out of North Bend on a trail up in the logging route.
Please stay on the line for the fire department. Hang on just a moment, please.
Cedar Balm was taken to Harborview Medical Center with injuries that were deemed serious but not life-threatening. The authorities returned to the site of the attack and found the cougar standing over Brooks, whom it had fatally mauled. The beast had actually dragged the victim back to the woodline. It evaded the encounter with the authorities but was ultimately tracked down with dogs and killed. The cougar was a male weighing around 100 pounds, which is 40 to 80 pounds underweight. While hunger is believed to have been the main reason behind the attack, its brain was also examined for diseases such as rabies, which would have made it more aggressive. Number 7. Peter McCombie. In early July of 2020, an elderly man was fatally struck by a cyclist on London's Bow Road. 23-year-old Emir Loka reportedly jumped the red light. While going an estimated 15 miles per hour, he plowed into 73-year-old Peter McCombie, who was on a pedestrian crossing. According to witnesses, he told the pensioner, "Look what you've done," as he picked up his bike. Loka fled the scene as McCombie lay bleeding and unconscious on the road. He was hospitalized with a fractured skull and passed away from severe brain injuries 8 days later. Near the end of July, Loka turned himself into the authorities. The man, originally from Albania, was charged with manslaughter. He told the authorities that he'd fled the scene in a panic, both because of what had happened and due to his immigration status, which wasn't finalized yet. Number 6. Shawn Bradley. Shawn Bradley, a former player in the NBA, became paralyzed in early 2021 following a bike collision in Utah. Bradley is one of the tallest athletes to have ever competed in the organization. At 7 feet and 6 inches, he towered over Michael Jordan by more than a foot. Following his retirement from professional basketball in 2005, Bradley became an avid cyclist. It helped him keep his weight down, and on several occasions, he went on rides of 100 or more miles. In 2011, he told a media outlet that cycling was like a mental game and that after riding his bike in the morning, he wanted to eat healthy the rest of the day. On January the 20th of 2021, the 48-year-old was struck from behind by a motorist while riding his bike near his home in St. George. Bradley fell on a parked car and sustained a traumatic spinal cord injury that left him paralyzed from the waist down. He underwent neck fusion surgery and months of rehabilitation at a local hospital. According to a statement by the Dallas Mavericks, his former team, Bradley planned to use the accident to advocate for bike safety. Number 5. Swooping Magpie Accident. In September of 2019, an elderly Australian cyclist suffered a fatal crash while trying to fend off a swooping magpie. The unnamed 76-year-old was riding through a park in Wollongong, New South Wales, when the bird attacked. As he was trying to escape it, the man veered off the path and into a park fence. Paramedics attended to him at the scene, but he was later pronounced dead at a local hospital. While such fatalities are quite rare, there have been other reports of magpies swooping down on pedestrians and cyclists at the park. The birds are particularly aggressive during mating season and will swoop down on perceived threats to their territory. Number 4. Daphne Tombanakis. In July of 2020, a cyclist on a cross-country trip was fatally struck by a pickup truck in Maple Ridge, Canada. 24-year-old Daphne Tombanakis had previously ridden through Poland, Greece, Turkey, and many other European countries. She'd recently returned to Canada after spending a year studying in Colombia. Tombanakis felt that she hadn't seen enough of her home country and decided to ride her bike from Vancouver to Montreal, where her parents and sister lived. The trip would have seen her travel over 3,100 miles in 50 days. Tombanakis was at the beginning of the trip when she was struck by a Ford pickup. She succumbed to her injuries at the scene. The driver, an unnamed 37-year-old man, reportedly cooperated with the police. The authorities have stated that drugs or alcohol hadn't been involved in the accident, but did ask witnesses to step forward to provide further details for their investigation. Number 3. Alessandro Zanardi. In the 1990s, Alessandro Zanardi was a kart world champion who also drove Formula One. His career was on the rise until a kart accident at the 2001 American Memorial resulted in the amputation of both his legs. Zanardi wouldn't be deterred by the injury and returned to racing in 2003. Not only that, but he also became a prolific competitor in hand cycling, which is a form of Paralympic cycling. Zanardi won gold and silver medals both in the 2012 London Paralympics and in the 2016 Paralympics in Rio de Janeiro. In the summer of 2020, however, Zanardi suffered a devastating accident that left him battling for his life. While taking part in a competition in Italy, his home country, Zanardi lost control of his handbike while going downhill. He veered into an oncoming truck and was struck, sustaining severe facial and cranial trauma. Zanardi was airlifted to a hospital in Siena and later transferred to Padua so that he could be treated closer to his home. For months, he remained in serious condition and underwent multiple facial reconstruction surgeries. According to the latest report from January of 2021, Zanardi was able to speak again. Number 2. Brad Treat. In 2016, 38-year-old mountain biker Brad Treat was killed by a grizzly bear on a trail outside Glacier National Park in Montana. He was in the Half Moon Lakes area when he stumbled upon the bear while accompanied by a second rider whose name wasn't released. It's believed that Treats accidentally collided with the bear at high speed after rounding a blind curve on the trail. He flew over the handlebars, either onto or over the massive beast. He shattered both wrists while attempting to break the fall with his hands. Treat's riding partner, who was about 20 yards ahead of him, turned around to see the very big brownish-black bear standing over him. Neither rider had weapons, bear spray, or their cell phones. Lacking the proper resources to intervene, the second rider went to get help while the grizzly was focused on Treat. When responders arrived at the scene, they found that Treat had been mauled to death. His helmet had also been bitten to pieces. Bear experts believed that the attack hadn't been predatory in nature, but a reaction to the grizzly feeling threatened. The authorities launched a search for the animal, but it's unclear if they ever found it. Number 1. Las Vegas crash. On December the 10th of 2020, 5 cyclists were killed and several others were injured on a road between Boulder City and Searchlight, Nevada, after their group was hit by a box truck. About 20 cyclists were on an annual 130-mile ride through the desert in Nevada and California, while accompanied by a Subaru Outback support vehicle. It carried water, snacks, and spare tires for the trip. 45-year-old Arizona man Jordan Barson, driving his regular route in an Isuzu box truck, was behind the cyclists and the accompanying vehicle. At some point, the group split into two, with the stronger cyclist riding ahead of the Subaru and the others drifting behind it. Barson lost control of his vehicle and struck the trailing cyclist before rear-ending the Subaru. 7 cyclists were ejected from their bikes as they were impacted by the box truck. 5 of them died at the scene with their bodies horrifically mangled and contorted. The victims, the majority of whom were Las Vegas residents, ranged in age from 39 to 57. The Subaru's driver and the other cyclists injured in the crash were later stabilized. Barson, who wasn't hurt in the accident, told the officers that he'd fallen asleep behind the wheel. Blood tests would later reveal that he had a high level of methamphetamine in his system. He admitted to having taken the drug the day before the crash and claimed that he'd had trouble sleeping afterwards. Barson faced a dozen felony charges that would see him spend multiple decades in state prison. Thanks for watching. What topic do you think we should do next? Let us know in the comments section below.